Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erica Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erica Mayall. Today, we are going to get into talking about pre-pointe assessments or screening assessments or pointe readiness assessments or whatever you want to call them. They go by many, many different names. But essentially, we're going to chat about how to determine when a dancer is ready to progress to pointe. Now, if you've been around here for any length of time, or really a long, long time since the beginning, there is another podcast episode on a similar topic from way back when. I believe it was one of the first couple of episodes. I'm pretty sure it was episode 4 of the podcast. So that was like 2 years ago or so. But I am going to redo, it's not the exact same podcast episode, but I know a lot of you guys are more recent listeners. And also there is just some updated information. So I figured it was time to revisit this topic. It felt timely right now to do an episode on this topic because I've actually been spending the last couple of weeks doing a lot of pre-pointe assessments. I have a lot of dancers who come into the clinic individually for them, but this time of year is also the time when I actually end up going out to a lot of different dance studios in my community and doing group pre-pointe assessments. So I have one more on my schedule for this coming weekend, and then I think that I'm done for the ones that are currently booked in at least. But I was posting about it a bit on my Instagram stories, and I had a lot of people reach out just curious about what the process was and asking questions and stuff. And then even at one of the studios I went to, it was the first year that I had done an in-person group pre-pointe assessment at this studio. And one of the teachers, the teacher who so kindly organized the whole thing, she was like, how did I not know this was an option before to have somebody come in and do it? So I thought today was a good time to sit down and chat about all things pre-pointe assessments. Just so we're all on the same page, and I'm sure a lot of you guys know this, and if you've listened to the previous podcast episode on this, when we are talking about pointe readiness or determining if a dancer is ready to progress to pointe, we want to make sure that we are covering all our bases and making sure that that dancer is going to be as safe as possible when they progress to pointe. We know that dancers who are dancing on pointe are at an increased risk of injury, specifically foot and ankle injuries, but actually other injuries as well. And that's partly because dancing on pointe is anatomically not a sort of quote unquote normal thing to do. We are not anatomically designed to be standing on the ends of our toes and having our entire body weight bearing down through our feet and onto the tips of our toes. That is not how we are designed just as human beings to move through the world or to, perform locomotion. So when we are asking dancers to perform and dance in this way, we need to make sure that they are really safe doing this. And historically, we used to really just consider the age of a dancer and potentially maybe their level of experience and sort of training. And so I'm sure a lot of you, and especially if you're a teacher listening to this, probably grew up in the era where it was just like when you're 12 years old, you're ready to progress to pointe. And that was like a really kind of arbitrary number. And interestingly enough, that number was maybe like a little bit more recent. So I am going to reveal myself here. I'm 43. And so grew up dancing like I would have been, preparing for pointe work around 30 years ago. And this sort of age of 12 years old was one of the things that was probably the predominant factor in determining if dancers were ready for pointe work. But prior to that, if we look back even further in history, dancers were much older when they progressed to pointe. It was not uncommon for dancers to be more like, say, 60 16 or so when they were starting out pointe work. And then somewhere along the line, and I actually don't know exactly when or sort of how it came about, it became much more of a thing for dancers to be, or for this magic age of 12 to be considered the time when dancers were ready to progress to pointe. There is a lot of misinformation that circulates around this, and still to this day within the dance world, and I see it a lot in public forums like Facebook groups and stuff for dance teachers, where there's still a lot of misinformation in terms of the belief that the reason 12 was this kind of like magic age was because that is when the growth plates in our feet close, and therefore there's going to be less risk of injury or damage to a dancer's feet. And I have no idea where that idea came from, because growth plates in the feet do not close at 12 years old, and they really actually don't close until much later than that. And even if in some dancers growth plates were to close at 12 years old, that certainly does not hold true for all dancers. As we know, dancers who are going through like adolescent growth spurt or just growth in general, it's going to vary hugely from dancer to dancer. So this idea that like 12 was this magic age is kind of a little bit absurd, and again, like was not actually rooted in any type of kind of sound science or theory. It really just came out of who knows where. There was probably a little bit of a correlation when we see dancers who are following syllabus progressions, that if a dancer starts dancing when they're, let's say 5 years old and they're starting in like pre-primary ballet, if they progress through their ballet syllabus in a fairly linear fashion, they're probably approaching the levels where pointe work is then introduced into the syllabus around 12-ish years old. Again, this is going to be hugely variable. Not all dancers start dancing when they're really little. Some dancers take 2 years to complete a grade level in ballet. Some dancers don't do exams. Lots of dancers don't follow syllabus. So again, this is not like a hard and fast rule, but I think that maybe that is partially where this came from. Anyway, all of that to say that we really do not consider age to be a determining factor for pointe readiness. We will still consider minimum ages. Like I am not going to do a pre-pointe assessment on, say, an 8-year-old, partly because I just know that they are not going to pass the assessment requirements. And so one of the things that does still hold true is a lot of dancers will probably be at the point where they can pass the physical assessment tasks around that same age. But we certainly have dancers who are younger than 12. Like I will say even fairly often we'll see 11-year-old dancers who are ready to start pointe work. And very, very commonly we'll have dancers who are older than 12. So it may be a dancer who's like 13, 14, 16. We have adult dancers who are progressing to pointe work. So again, the age really is irrelevant, other than the fact that we will still potentially consider a lower age limit. And it's not a hard and fast rule. It's not that I'm like, you absolutely cannot go on pointe if you're 11 years old. It really is that we're going to look at the whole pre-pointe assessment picture and then take their age into consideration. And the age really actually has more to do with their maturity level than anything. Like chronological age is really not a determining factor for pointe readiness. So if we are not using age and these kind of like old school criteria, what are we using? Well, this is where these kind of pointe readiness assessments come in. And so there's actually been a lot of research over the past, let's say 15, maybe closer to 20 years, but like for sure 15 years, where people have really looked at this to try and determine like how do we best assess which dancers are going to be at the lowest risk when progressing to pointe work. And so there's been some consensus within the research, and there was a study published in 2010, I believe, from some researchers at the Harkness Center in New York City. And that's been kind of considered maybe the gold standard for the last little while in terms of what tests or what assessment tasks we're looking at. And that study really specifically looked at or they looked at a whole bunch of different things, but the three tests that they found were the most reliable in terms of determining if a dancer was ready for pointe was the airplane test, the topple test, and the topple test is really essentially a single pirouette. So it's a provocation test, and you're looking at how well the dancer can control with that. And then a single leg sauté were the kind of three assessment tasks. I will link these research studies in the show notes. So if you want to find the references, I'll put those in for you. So that study, like I said, kind of came out in 2010, I believe. But more recently, there has been a few other things that have come out. And I'm going to get this year mixed up, but I'm going to say 2022. Don't quote me on that. I'll put it in the show notes. There was a systematic review. And so for those of you not familiar with what a systematic review is, that is a research study where they actually take all of the research studies on that same topic. So in this case, Pointe Readiness assessments, and they look at what is the consensus across all of these studies. So they did a systematic review and looked at all of the studies that were available to them, and they found similar findings to what the Harkness Center found in 2010. The topple test, the airplane test, the sauté test, and then they also found that a releve, a single leg releve, was relevant for pointe readiness. So very, very similar findings. Those ones were the most consistent in through there. More recently than that, there's been a Delphi study which involved dance teachers, so dance educators. And a Delphi study is an interesting methodology of study where they're looking for consensus among the study participants. So the kind of research question is, what things do you think are most important for a dancer to be ready to start pointe work? And they have a group of teachers and they go through these rounds. And so in round one, it's kind of the teachers will rank the order of importance. And then they'll come back in a second round and say, okay, this was the results from the first round. Now, based on that, here's the second round. And in this study, they did 3 rounds of this kind of consensus statement type research, or this Delphi study. And they found, and so again, this was dance teachers or ballet teachers, that ankle alignment, pelvic stability, ankle strength, ankle stability, and lower limb alignment were the things that the teachers felt were the most important when determining if a dancer was ready for pointe. So again, age plays no role in that. This was all based on physical characteristics. Can this dancer demonstrate the alignment, stability, strength necessary to be able to meet the demands of dancing on pointe? And then just really, really recently, within the last few weeks, I believe. So just coming out this year, there was another study that was, again, looking at a specific pre-pointe assessment test, or a specific assessment sheet, and looking at kind of inter-rater reliability in terms of the determination of pointe readiness. And similarly, they actually found that the strongest relationship for pointe readiness came from ankle plantar flexion range of motion. So some of you might be familiar with the term the pencil test, but looking at how much ankle plantar flexion range can a dancer achieve. So that was number 1. A grand plie, so just in first position, grand plie, control with that, and then the sauté test. The other tests that they also found to be relevant were the releve, the topple test, and the airplane test. So again, very similar to previous research, but this one included the ankle plantar flexion range of motion and grand plie. So across the board, and these are not the only research studies out there. These are just more recent ones that I probably didn't talk about on the last podcast because they're just a little bit more recent. The consensus, or what we are finding consistently, is the things that determine a dancer's readiness for pointe have more to do with function than they do with anything like level of ballet training or age or, experience in dance or things like that. So we're really looking at things like strength and alignment and stability and control. And it's not just foot and ankle. So there's this kind of thought within the dance world, or maybe, people who kind of understand that obviously we would need a lot of foot and ankle strength and control to be able to dance on point, but who then don't realize how much other strength and control is required. And so for a lot of the dancers who were assessing for pre-pointe readiness, it's actually maybe like pelvic control and stability or pelvic alignment or core strength or things like that they actually might be lacking. Like that might be the area that they need to continue to work on, not necessarily their foot and ankle strength. They might have absolutely adequate foot and ankle strength, but if we're not controlling well higher up the chain, we are still going to be at risk for injury. So we're very much looking at that whole package of all sorts of things, but things like the airplane test and things like the topple test take into account more of, trunk and pelvic stability and control. And that is why those tests seem to be more reliable than some of the other things that were maybe historically used in the past for pointe readiness. So there's lots of different actual assessment forms or assessments that you can follow out there. And I know some dance teachers have their own kind of assessment criteria, and that is absolutely fine as long as we know that we are covering the categories or the assessment tasks that are the most reliable according to the research. So if you were a dance teacher and you're like, well, I've always, decided when my dancers are ready to start pointe like myself, like I haven't brought in an outside person or sent them to an outside person, as long as you know what you are looking for in terms of those functional tests, that is 100% fine. I get this question a lot from people saying like, oh, well, do my dancers have to be assessed by, a physical therapist or by a medical professional because we don't have access to that in the community that we live in? And absolutely you do not. It can be performed by a ballet teacher for sure. However, it, in my opinion, should be a formal process, and there should be a, sort of set tasks that the dancers need to be able to accomplish. I really like to educate the dancers and kind of present pre-pointe assessments as a process. And so when I come into a studio, and especially if it's a studio I've never worked with before, and you have these dancers lined up in front of you, and oftentimes they look terrified. Like it's a really, really big moment in a ballet dancer's career to potentially be able to progress to pointe work. So I come in and they're all like so scared that I'm going to, say yes or say no, and that's going to be like the end of the world. And that's really not the point of these assessments at all. The pre-pointe assessment really should be a process, and in an ideal world, this is a process that may take place over a course of 6 months or 12 months or even 2 years. So we want to start to think about this before we think that a dancer is maybe ready. So maybe when we're thinking, okay, maybe at some point this year, this dancer is going to be ready, or maybe we're aiming for them to be ready at the start of the next dance season, we can start this process and do a screening assessment, or we sometimes will even call it like a baseline assessment, and see where a dancer is at and see where the areas are that they are already doing really well. So again, maybe their foot and ankle strength is actually totally adequate. They're doing really, really well in those categories. But maybe they're having more struggles with pelvic control or pelvic stability or things like that. And so it gives us information and data that we can then take to give that dancer a really structured sort of plan in what they need to work on to get them to the point where they are ready to progress to pointe work. I know that when I was a dancer, my dance teacher, so we didn't have any sort of formal pointe assessments. It was just our ballet teacher who would, periodically pull somebody aside after class and kind of tell them that they were ready and that they could schedule an appointment to go get fitted for pointe shoes. And it was all kind of secretive in the sense that it was never presented to the entire class. It was always one individual person or maybe two people or whatever. And there wasn't ever any information about why some people were ready and some people weren't. And so I know for myself, I really felt a little bit in the dark about why some of my friends were allowed to go buy pointe shoes, but I wasn't, had not been given permission for that yet, and didn't necessarily know what it was that I needed to work on. Looking back now, I can absolutely see what it was that I needed to work on. And I can see like where my ballet teacher was coming from. But none of that was communicated to us. So it felt a little bit like favoritism a lot of the time, where it was just like, oh, so-and-so's like one of her favorites. And so she gets to have pointe shoes, but I don't get to have pointe shoes yet. And really, that was not it at all. Like my ballet teacher actually did a very good job of making it individual. Like it was not, okay, you've reached this grade of ballet, everybody's going to get pointe shoes. It was very much like individually, she would decide when each of us were ready. But none of that was communicated to us. And for me, especially, nerdy little me who really liked anatomy and science, like if it had been explained to me that I needed to work more on these specific things, I would have absolutely accepted that and really like appreciated it, because it would have given me a concrete thing to feel like I had ownership over the process and could be putting in that effort to work towards it, rather than it just feeling like this arbitrary thing where I was like, well, maybe I'm never going to get pointe shoes, when in fact it was just, certain things I still needed to work on. So that is one of the reasons why I feel strongly about pre-pointe assessments, because I think it should be a really, really transparent process for the dancer and also for the parent, to be honest. A lot of parents of young dancers don't necessarily come from a dance background. They do not understand, A, the risks associated with pointe work, B, the strength and control required for it, and C, any of the criteria about when a dancer is going to progress to pointe. And I'm sure all of you have heard stories about like little 6-year-old Susie who shows up for ballet class, like her very first ballet class ever, and arrives at the studio and the parent is like, and here are her pointe shoes. And teachers are just like horrified. But the parent doesn't necessarily know any better. They see ballet dancers and professional ballet dancers dancing in pointe shoes. So they don't know that, you don't start with those when you're 6 years old. So we really need to make an effort to educate parents on what the process is as well, because otherwise I think it can also, just seem a little bit arbitrary, or parents are like, oh, but my child has reached this level of ballet, therefore they get their pointe shoes, when really it's going to be super individual based on an individual dancer's anatomy and strength and control and all of those things we just talked about. So that is why I really feel strongly that there should be a formal kind of like pre-pointe assessment process in place at a studio. And it should be a process that takes place over the course of the dance years, as opposed to it just being this one point in time where we're looking at somebody and saying yes or no. It's like part of, at the beginning of the year, we have our assessment, we see where we're at, and then we reassess in, some studios it's 3 months' time, some it's 6 months' time. Sometimes it's like, okay, we're actually going to assess at the beginning of the next year. That was just to give us a baseline for what to work on in pre-pointe this year. So it's going to depend on the dancers, like exactly what that looks like, but it opens the door to those conversations of being like, okay, this is a process and these are the requirements that the dancer needs to achieve. I love that a lot of studios have started to do pre-pointe assessments more at the beginning of the year. So when I first started clinical practice nearly 20 years ago, it was really common for me to be doing pre-pointe assessments with dancers at the end of a dance year. And I think part of that was a lot of the studios that I work with locally do ballet exams, and they follow like a ballet syllabus. And so the exams are usually in the spring. And so dancers were completing their exams in sort of like maybe the end of March or like April, May. And then if they, or when they completed that level, then we were often like sort of like assessing for for pointe readiness in anticipation of them moving up to the next level in the following year. And that was really normal. And I actually think, I was trying to think back and remember when I got pointe shoes. And I'm sure that that is also when I got pointe shoes, was like at the end of a year after I had completed, well, I don't even remember what level ballet, but after I'd completed an exam, that then I started kind of like intro pointe work. And I don't love this for a couple of reasons. First of all, the end of the year is just crazy. There's a lot going on with end of year recitals, and now there's, still competitions going, and there's nationals, and there's like all of this stuff. And a lot of dancers are really kind of burnt out at the end of the year, and their bodies are fatigued. And so I don't love it from that perspective. But the other thing that I don't love about it is dancers will sometimes then get exposure to beginning point work for maybe a month, 6 weeks if we're lucky at the end of a year. And then a lot of them are going to have the whole summer off, or parts of the summer off, or maybe they're not going to be training ballet in the summer because they're, going to nationals for another style of dance or whatever that is. And then when we come back in September, you almost have to like rebuild some of that strength in order for them to then be at like an appropriate place. So I didn't love the timing of the like pre-pointe assessments kind of at the end of the year. I've noticed a trend over the last however many years that most studios have seemed to move that to the beginning of a dance year, kind of around this time. And that makes so much more sense to me, because if we have dancers, we may have some dancers who it's like, okay, we're doing their pre-pointe screening right at the beginning of the year, and we actually think they're going to be totally ready and totally fine, and they're going to start point work like, in October, let's say, or even November, whatever. But for those dancers who are not yet ready, it again gives them this runway of the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12, like whatever it is, for them to specifically work on the tasks and the skills that they still need to work on. And so again, it just seems to fit in more nicely to me for it to be more of a ongoing process of, continuous evaluation, as opposed to this like line in the sand. You get point shoes this year. You don't get point shoes this year. We'll check again in a year or whatever. This feels much more like okay, these are the things that you did well on the assessment. These are the things that we still need to work on, and then gives them the dance year to work on those things. And then it can become a continuous process where if we have a dancer who say they're assessed in October, there's some things they need to work on, but they're given a pathway or a program to address those issues. And come January or February, it's clear that they're then meeting all of those criteria. Well, then they can start point work at that point in the season. And so it can become a little bit more of this kind of continuous rolling process, or more individualized, I guess, as opposed to in the past when maybe it was a bit more of this whole class is ready and they're all going to start point at the same time, or this whole class is not ready and nobody gets to start point. And so again, it was a bit more like black and white, when really it should be an individual thing. It should be when each individual dancer is ready to start point. So all of that just to say about timing. If we're thinking about the timing, I do like the beginning of the dance year, and not the first week of classes when dancers are just back after having the summer off. But once we're kind of back into the schedule, sort of October into the beginning of November, that really is a very nice time to do sort of a first round of pre-pointe assessments and then have a pathway forward for the rest of the year. All right. I think that is the majority of what I wanted to say. The final thing I will say, just because I do a poor job of plugging my own products, but if you are a dance teacher and you're like, yes, I want to make my pre-pointe assessments or my pre-pointe assessment process a little bit more formalized and have like a proper evaluation form and all of that sort of thing, I do have a pre-pointe assessment toolkit on my website that is specifically for dance teachers. It is the exact pre-pointe assessment that I use. So if I'm going into a dance studio and I am doing a group pre-pointe assessment, there is specific tasks that I am looking at that include the things we talked about, like the topple test and the airplane test and the saute, but it has other things in it as well. So all of the tests that I use are available to any teacher within the pre-pointe assessment toolkit, along with instructions on how to perform each of the tasks and then what the criteria are for the dancer to pass. And so again, within the research, these have been kind of validated. And so for the airplane test, there's a certain number of repetitions that a dancer needs to be able to complete, and the same with the saute and things like that. So if that is something that interests you, I will link it in the show notes. It's also available on my website. It is a downloadable product. It also has like individual pre-pointe assessment. So if you're just going to do one student at a time and do it in a more individual setting, which is what we do if dancers come into the clinic for a pre-pointe assessment, that's obviously we're looking at the same tasks, but we're looking at it on an individual basis. So the toolkit has a template for an individual assessment. It also has a template for a group assessment if you're going to do it with a whole class of your ballet dancers all at once. And then, like I said, it has all the instructions, and it has sort of like little video instructions of what all of the tests are in terms of what we are expecting dancers to be able to accomplish. So if that is something you're interested in, check it out in the show notes or on the website. It is just called the pre-pointe assessment toolkit, I believe. Pointe Readiness assessment toolkit, maybe. I'm not even sure what it's called, but I'll put it in the show notes for you anyway. But I just thought I would throw that out there because I know that it is not feasible for every studio to be able to bring in a healthcare professional to do their pre-pointe testing. Some studios really like it. The studios I work with, regularly and have for years, they really like having an outside person do it because they feel like it just takes away some of that, potential like favoritism or bias. If it's a teacher who's known a dancer since they were like 3 years old, there's always going to be some inherent biases. And so they really like having an outsider, a more objective person coming in to do it. But there are a lot of ballet teachers who are really used to doing those assessments and making that decision on their own and want to continue doing that. And that is absolutely 100% fine, especially if you're in an area where you don't have access to healthcare providers that you can collaborate with. But I really would encourage you to make sure that it is sort of a valid and reliable assessment tool that you're using, and you're not just basing it on your own inherent biases about the skill of the dancer or things like that. We want to really make sure that physically they are ready to progress to pointe. So something like the pre-pointe assessment toolkit is a really good option for that. Like I said, there's other ones available out there as well. I can't think of any of them off the top of my head. I'd have to look them up. I can't think of any of them off the top of my head, but there are other pre-pointe assessment tools available out there as well. So I would encourage you to find one that works for you in your setting and make sure that we are making this like a really transparent and objective process for progressing to pointe. All right, that's all I'm going to say today on that topic. If you have questions, comments, concerns, please reach out. You can reach me at Dance Physio Erica on all the social media platforms, or send me an email. My email is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.